Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and this presentation is on the labor theory of value. So let's start with some background. Okay, early economic theory sought to explain both the value and the price of commodities. Okay, so let's define these terms. A price is the amount of money it takes to purchase a commodity. Value is the amount of money that a commodity is worth. Okay, so we are using money terms to understand both these things. Okay, we have the appearance of value, and then we have the essence of value. Um, Commodity, that definition of that is an item that's produced for sale on a market. Political economy from the 17th to the 19th century describes the two sources of value as number one, land, that is nature, and number two, labor. Okay, um, since only labor is something we really have control over, it makes sense to use labor as a theoretical basis of value. So this is an early economist, this is William Petty, and here's a quote from Petty. Okay, all things ought to be valued by two natural denominations, which is land and labor. Right, that's from his treatise on taxes and contributions from 1662. Here's another influential figure in history of Western thought. This is John Locke. Uh, and Locke developed, of course, known for a theory of property and property rights, but he used the labor theory of value to conceptualize that. So here's a quote from him: "Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his." So, famous quote there from Locke. Now, you might have seen this guy's face before. If you've ever seen U.S. currency, $100 bill, this is Benjamin Franklin. And here's a quote from Franklin. Franklin is not really known as an economic thinker primarily, I think, in the United States, but he was one, very influential, in fact. Wrote in the early 1700s. So here's his quote: "By labor may the value of silver be measured as well as other things." So in this section, he's talking about what determines the value not just of commodities but also of things like gold and silver. Um, as suppose one man is employed to raise corn while another is digging and refining silver, at the year's end the complete produce of corn and that of silver are the natural price of each other. And if one be 20 bushels and the other 20 ounces, then an ounce of that silver is worth the labor of raising a bushel of that corn. So Franklin wrote before Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith is again one of these foundational figures in the history of economic thought, and had an influence on Smith as well as many others. So here's Adam Smith. Um, Look at that wig, fantastic. The value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. Okay, and this is from Smith's famous work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations from 1776. Again, one of the foundational figures in the history of economic thought. Here's David Ricardo, wrote a few decades later, also in England, and here's a quote from Ricardo: "The value of a commodity or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production, and not on the greater or less compensation which is paid for that labor." Okay, this is from Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, right at the beginning in chapter 1. Right, most of these thinkers discussed value theory right at the beginning, okay, especially Smith and Ricardo. So this is Marx, right? And Karl Marx developed and refined labor theory of value, added new aspects to it, and that's mostly what we're going to focus on, right? So Marx is not unique at all in terms of using a labor theory of value, but Marx used it in a very particular way, okay? So because Marx is also a huge figure in the history of economic thought, and because Marx is a very controversial figure as well, right, being a critic of capitalism, Marx has sort of taken over the labor theory of value, and 99 times out of 100, when somebody's talking about labor theory of value, they're talking about Marxism, right? Or they're talking about Marx's version of the labor theory of value. There are differences and variations and so forth within these different theories, but Marx, of course, has the advantage of being able to learn from everyone who came before. Right? Marx was very well read in the history of economic thought, so he's well aware of the arguments of Petty and Franklin and Smith and Ricardo and all of these figures. Right? So he refers to them and so forth, learns from their points of view and adds to them. Okay, so he takes the existing idea of use value, that is from Adam Smith, okay, and here's a quote from Marx. This is from Capital Volume 1 in Chapter 1. Commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles or goods such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plain, homely, bodily form. They are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility and at the same time depositories of value. All right? So use value. Then Marx also describes exchange value. Okay, so here's a quote not far from that first one. Let us take two commodities, example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. Example, 1/4 of corn equals X hundredweight of iron. So in England, a hundredweight is 112 pounds. Confusing, I know, but anyway. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and X hundredweight of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. Okay, so use value and exchange value. So use value comes from the qualities of the items. Okay, there's, whatever it is, right? Iron is useful for certain things, corn useful for other things, right? It's about what it can be used for. That comes from its qualities, right? It's a qualitative determination, not a quantitative one, right? If we're talking about quantities, then we're talking about, well, 1 pound of iron is different from 4 pounds of iron, right? So, but the point is, right, the use value of iron, whether there's 1 or 4, is the same. They can be used for the same thing, right? Exchange value, on the other hand, comes from the amount of socially necessary abstract labor that is embodied in the commodity, and exchange value is quantitative. Okay, we don't care what the particular qualities of something are when we're talking about its exchange value, right? This is why we can use the same money units to talk about a whole variety of goods and services, right? Like, what can you buy with $100? Well, we are talking about a certain amount of exchange value, right? That's what we're talking about with that unit. Okay, so let's get into this term, okay, SNALT. So Marxists have abbreviated this phrase from Marx, socially necessary abstract labor time, because it's such a long phrase, right? Marxists, showing that they do indeed have a sense of humor, have given it this weird acronym, SNALT. Okay, so let's go through and explain each part of this, all right? So socially necessary is the beginning of that, right? So what this means is labor only creates value at the average or socially necessary level of productivity in the society, okay? So example, right? Let's say that it takes an hour to paint a fence, and that represents a kind of average level of productivity, right? So he said everyone knows, okay, look, it takes an hour to paint the fence of this particular size and so forth, right? So if it takes you 2 hours, well, you're simply below the average level of productivity, right? That doesn't make the fence painting twice as valuable, even though it took you twice as long. It still has an hour of socially necessary labor in it, not 2 hours, right? Working slower doesn't make things more valuable, and everyone knows this, right? This is just only logical, right? Now, conversely, okay, if you have some kind of super speed, like the Flash or Superman or whatever, right? You can paint that fence in 10 seconds. Well, look, there's still an average level of productivity in society. You're just now well below that, right? Wow, I didn't know I didn't even know that was possible. Damn, okay, that's quite a fence painting job, right? But it still contains an hour of socially necessary labor because, you're just one person, right? You happen to be faster, a lot faster in this example than the average, but the average still holds, right? That's what we mean by socially necessary labor. Okay, so what about the next part, abstract? Well, markets have this ability of comparing many different forms of labor, even though they're all different, right? And forming a kind of average of these. Okay, that's what abstract labor means. And it takes into account many differences between the different forms of what are called concrete labor. Okay, so meaning labor in that sense is always concrete, right? You're always doing a particular form of labor. You can't do labor in the abstract, right? No, nobody ever has. You have to do a certain kind of labor. Okay, you have to dig a hole or repair a bike or whatever it is, right? So there's in that sense there's many different forms of labor you could do, and then there's some reckoning process where they're weighed and determined, and what is abstract labor, right? How much abstract labor did it take? Okay, so how is this reckoned? Well, it's reckoned through markets. Okay, taking into account different levels of skill, training, risk, many other factors that go into determining, right, how much labor is in something. Okay, and then labor time. So obviously, every form of labor that we can think of involves time, takes place in time. Okay, but time is not the only factor, right? Like the above makes clear, time is modified by all these factors, right? So if something takes more skill, well, okay, then even if it took less time, it might actually be more socially necessary labor in there, right? Because, again, we are taking into account all of the different kinds of forms of labor that labor can take. Okay, so in order to understand these value categories, we're going to do an example so that you can see how it's used. Okay, and this example is of a factory that's producing chairs. I used this example in a previous lecture, so same kind of numbers here. Okay, so let's say that the chairs have a value which is equal to their price, and that is equal to $200. Okay, so just for simplicity, we're assuming that value and price are the same. And let's say that this shape, this rounded rectangle here, represents that $200. Okay, and we're going to break it down into its constituent parts in order to understand it and look at where did that come from. Okay, so Marx says, look, part of this, we're going to call it constant capital. Okay, we're going to use the term little c to indicate that constant capital. And what is this? This is the value of the raw materials, the depreciation, the tools, the equipment, the machinery that's used in production, the value of the building, and so forth, right? All of this Marx calls embodied labor, okay? Because all of this is the product of labor that has been done in the past. Sometimes Marx also calls it congealed labor or even dead labor, meaning labor in the past, not the present, the past, has been embodied or has congealed into the form of wood, screws, leather, thread, all of the things, the raw materials that are going to be used to produce this chair. But not only that, right? Things that are not raw materials but are used in the production process, and only a portion of them is used up. Okay, that's called depreciation. So example, right, if a certain tool, let's say a screwdriver, is used to screw the screws in, and the screwdriver costs $20 and is able to produce in that period 1,000 chairs, right? Well, only 1,000th of the value of that screwdriver goes into each chair, right? So, this is complicated to figure out, right? We have to do some accounting to figure out how much is the constant capital. But of course, this is part of production, right? Part of capitalism, part of business. Okay, so let's say that we know that this constant capital, all these things added up together, is equal to $60. Okay, so that's part of the cost of making the chair. But another cost of it is that the workers have to be paid. Okay, now Marx calls this variable capital, and he uses the term V to illustrate that. Now we'll have more to say later on about what determines the wage, but for now, let's just say we know what it is. Let's say it's $70. Okay, so now what is this extra that's left over, right? The C and the V, right? That's the cost of the raw materials and the capital, right? C, and also the cost of wages. this is the cost of production, okay? So in value terms, C plus V, we just call that the cost of production. Now this extra that still remains and hasn't been explained is S, surplus value, okay? Very, very important concept in Marxism, right? Marx is very, very interested in this, right? What is this surplus value? Well, this is also called the gross profit, right? That is the remainder after the direct costs of production have been paid, and this surplus value is then taken, appropriated by the capitalist, okay? And we can see exactly how much it is, right? If it cost $130, that's 60 plus $70 to produce the good, right? And that's this part, right? And yet the value is $200. The surplus must then be equal to $70, okay? V plus the S, again, very important. This is called living labor. What it represents is the value that's been added by workers now, okay? So that's the term living, right? It means it comes out of a live process, right? Labor is a process. And how much value does that process add to the existing value that you started with, right? You started with $60 in raw materials and tools, equipment, etc., right? Workers added $140 of value to that, okay? So let's go on and talk about some important concepts and equations that Marx develops out of this, okay? So the first is just the value expression, okay? So value, or W, is equal to C plus V plus S. And that just, represents value in its component, constituent parts, right? Its components. So in this example, 200, right? The cost of production, as I mentioned, C plus V, okay? And in this example, it's $130, right? So $60 in C, $70 in V, $130. Okay, the next term is called the value rate of profit. Often the term R is used to denote that. This is equal to the S, okay, the surplus value, divided by the total cost of production, C plus V. Okay, so in this example, the surplus is 70, the cost of production 130, so 70 over 130 gives us 0.538. Next term is called the organic composition of capital. Okay, so this is equal to the constant capital, C, divided by the cost of production, C plus V. All right, so what this measures is how much constant capital are we using relative to the total cost of production. Okay, so important term, right? This looks at how much of the cost of production is in constant capital relative to the total, right? So in this example, it's 60 divided by 130. So this gives us 0.462. Next, we have the rate of exploitation, which Marx also calls the rate of surplus value. Okay, this is simply S divided by V. And what this measures is how much are workers producing, which is then going to be appropriated by somebody else, right? That is the definition of exploitation in Marxism, when someone else appropriates your surplus, right? Relative to what part of it you get to keep, right? But what part of it is the wage, okay? So S over V. In this example, S and V are the same magnitude, okay? They're both 70. So 70 over 70 gives us 1, okay? Now it's not necessary that any of these figures, right, add up to what they add up in this example. Of course not, right? The rate of exploitation, for example, could be greater than 1 or less than 1 or equal to or whatever, right? It's just a measure. Like any measure within economic theory, it allows us to see, again, the surplus relative to the part that workers are paid, okay? Marx also refers to surplus as unpaid labor, okay? So this would be the unpaid over the paid labor. Marx's labor theory of value argues that value is a social category, okay? It's not an individual category, it's a social category. So that's very different for us, especially in the United States, right? It's a highly, highly individualistic society. We are used to thinking that everything is, from us or whatever, right? Like each individual is like an island. Marxism isn't really like that, right? Marx is saying value is socially determined, not individually determined, okay? And Marx is following again, long tradition, many hundreds of years within political economy of arguing that same thing, right? The point of Marx's labor theory of value is to reveal the existence of exploitation under capitalism. Even when a commodity is sold at its value and the worker is paid a fair wage, there's exploitation. Exploitation occurs when the surplus is taken by someone other than the direct producer, as I mentioned. And exploitation is the economic basis of capitalism, just as it was for slavery and feudalism, older modes of production which came before. Let's consider the issue now of price versus value. Okay, so Marx uses a simplifying assumption in volume 1 of Capital, which is assume the price P is equal to the value W. This is not a necessary assumption by any means, right? But in volume 2, volume 3, Marx relaxes this assumption. Okay, the reason for this assumption is to explain that profits are made when a commodity is sold at its value, not only when the price is greater than the value, right? Obviously, you're going to make additional profits if you can sell something for more than what it's worth. That's fantastic from the perspective of the seller, right? That's great, right? But Marx says, look, that's not possible all the time. That's possible only some of the time. You cannot have an entire economy where every single commodity is selling at a price above its value. Even if you did somehow have that, that wouldn't explain where profits come from, right? Because, as Marx points out, well, you would gain any time that you're a seller, but you would lose every time that you were a buyer. And in any market, you have to both buy and sell. So you can't possibly explain the source of profits by saying, well, people sell things above the value, right? No. So Marx, again, followed the tradition in political economy of saying, things are sold in general at their value. Let's just assume that, okay? Marx recognizes that prices can fluctuate, all right? But the basic argument is that the price is overdetermined, okay? More on this in a sec. And it might differ from the value for many different reasons. It is possible, right? Even though he makes a simplifying assumption, volume 1, later on he then relaxes that assumption and says, listen, it's possible that price and value can differ, okay? That does happen. We know that happens. Value and price do not necessarily always have to be equal. But for analytical purposes, Marx begins with that assumption. In order to understand this, we need to get into Marx's method and philosophy a little bit more deeply. Okay, so Marx uses the logic of contradiction. Okay, which he learned from Hegel. Hegel called this dialectics or dialectical logic. Okay, and it developed an entire huge study of the differences between dialectical logic and formal logic, which Hegel critiqued. Marx modifies Hegel's dialectic. Marx likes the term dialectical materialism. Okay, so the whole complex history of this and whatever. Later, Marxists have sometimes adopted the term that comes from Freud. Althusser uses this term, overdetermination. That's a nice term because it offers a kind of update of this philosophical position. It's the same position that Marx used. It's just a different term for it. Okay, what does this mean? Look, it means there is innumerable complex causes for any particular effect. Okay, and all of these causes are inseparable from one another. They also might contradict each other. They might move in opposing directions. This is what gives rise to complexity. Okay, so we have to appreciate that. That's Marx's method. Okay, so if we didn't use that, we would end up with a much more simple, perhaps too simple, right? Maybe simple-minded type of explanation of price and value. Okay, so this is called economic determinism. All right, so what might that look like if we took Marx's argument and made it into a kind of determinism? Well, it might look like this. Okay, we have socially necessary abstract labor time, SNALT, right? And that causes the value of a commodity. Okay, so far, right? That's a good summary of what we've said, right? What causes value? Well, we're talking about the labor theory of value, right? But now we're talking about what comes next, right? How does this relate to the price of the commodity? Okay, so if we say, well, it causes it, right? It causes it like A causes B, right? Well, now we have committed a certain kind of determinism. That is, we have reduced the complex reasons why the price might be what it is into something very simple, okay? Now, determinism is very, very common, right? Like, we love determinism. We want a simple, clear explanation for whatever it is that we're talking about. So because economic determinism, really all forms of determinism, is so very common in explanations within economics, really of anything, right? Many interpret Marx to be making this argument, but it's just not correct. Marx was deeply opposed to this kind of deterministic, simplistic theorizing. In economics, he called that vulgar economics, right? It's too simple-minded, okay? So Marx's argument is, look, okay, we have SNALT, socially necessary abstract labor time, and that leads to the value of a commodity. Yes, okay, that part we got. But what is the relationship between the value and the price, right? Well, we use this two-headed arrow here to represent that it's complicated, right? It's a complex relationship. It's not a simple cause and effect relationship. This causes that, right? Like one billiard ball strikes another billiard ball and then it goes into the pocket or something like that, right? That's a simple deterministic relationship, right? The relationship between value and price is not at all like that, right? And Marx makes it very clear that it's not at all like that, right? That the price of a commodity is shaped by many, many, many different factors, right? So we could look at, for example, market power. If there's not very many buyers or sellers, does that mean that one side has more power than the other? Yes, absolutely it means that, right? Might they not use that power to then charge a higher price than what the value is, or demand a lower price, depending on which one has the power? Absolutely, right? Of course. And by the way, do capitalist firms want market power? Of course they do, right? Will they spend money in order to get it? Yes, right? No question. Okay, so, but again, right, this is one of many possibilities. What about cultural factors? Might those play a role? Absolutely, right? Our notions of the meaning that we give to commodities and what do they say about us and so forth, right? Is that related to the price and is affected by the price as well? Yes, of course, right? And so on, right? The structure of the market, right? And many other things, okay? So shifts in demand, etc., right? The point is, prices are overdetermined, okay? They are both a cause and the effect of many, many forces in society, okay? And it's just not possible to isolate this. It's not, and it's not wise to say that there's a simple deterministic relationship when there's clearly not, right? That would be, like making a mistake almost on purpose, right? We know it's complicated. Why then should we argue that it's simple, right? And Marx really does not do this, right? That's just a very, very simplistic interpretation of Marx. Unfortunately, many Marxists have been guilty of having this interpretation of Marx, right? But it's really not in the spirit of Marx's philosophy and Marx's epistemology. Let me get this straight, right? What you're saying is that the value leads to the price, and at the same time, the price leads to the value? What? What the hell is going on here, right? So the answer is yes. That is exactly what we're saying, right? The logic of overdetermination suggests that cause and effect are not separable. So ultimate or absolute causation, the notions of that, it's just simply not possible, okay? So I know it sounds very contrary to what we like to hear, right? Oh, they cause each other. What are we saying then, right? Well, we're saying, in short, we're saying it's complex. Many factors are involved, and we're acknowledging that complexity, right? That's very important. Let's talk about the difference between an essence versus an essentialism, okay? So Marx does posit labor as the essence of value, okay? But he does not make it an essentialism, okay? He does not make it a simplistic, deterministic relationship there, all right? There's a difference between these things. So Marx does not argue, right, that labor, SNALT, right, socially necessary abstract labor time, will ultimately determine prices, or allow you to predict the movement of prices, right? He does not argue that, okay? Um, and that's good, right? Because the fact is that no theory has a good record of predicting prices, and that is to be expected from the perspective of overdetermination, right? Prices are complex. Look, complex things are unpredictable, that's their nature, right? So it's okay, we expect that, right? We're not making our explanation or our theory contingent on whether or not it does a good job of predicting, right? Because no theory, right? Theory is a simplification. That means we're removing factors from our understanding, from our analysis, which we must do because otherwise we would never finish our theory, right? We would never be able to say anything because new things are happening all the time, right? We're hardly even aware of all of them, right? We can't possibly explain every single factor. We have to simplify. Well, what if we missed some things? We know we missed a whole bunch of things, right? How do we know that the things that we examined are the critical things? We don't know that, right? So that is all what the logic of overdetermination, okay? And the my thinking here is very much shaped by Resnick and Wolff, for example, in Contending Economic Theories, and also Roberts from 1981, Value Categories and Marxian Method, a different view of the value-price transformation. So why use the labor theory of value at all? Well, if we want to understand prices, or anything that's the product of complexity, right? Anything that's overdetermined, we have to start somewhere. We have to examine some causes, and that means we can't examine others, right? We have to make some choices. And labor is a fundamental way that humans relate to the world. And so it represents a kind of sensible entry point in order to theorize value, right? We've all had the experience of doing various kinds of labor, right? So it's not something that's foreign to us, right? It's something that we've all experienced. So let's look at some questions and some criticisms of the theory that have been asked and have been levied over the years. All right, so let's start with this one. Look at this. This is a tree. Okay, so question, does this tree have value? All right, so to answer this, let's just say, look, okay, exchange value, what we mean by that is a very particular thing, okay? It's only relevant to commodities, items that are produced for sale, okay? Things can be important and not have exchange value. Now look, our language isn't the best when it comes to this because value, the term value, has a lot of different meanings, right? We're using it in a very narrow fashion here, right? Exchange value. That means in terms of the currency unit that we're familiar with, it's a quantitative designation, right? Now, we don't always use value in that manner, right? We use value to mean all kinds of things that don't have any quantity attached to them, right? We use value in ways that are the opposite of exchange value, right? Like we might say to somebody, hey, I really value your friendship, right? And that doesn't mean it's worth $100, right? In fact, if you said it to your friend would probably be very insulted, right? Hey, I really value your friendship. It's worth $100 to me. You're like, what? That's get out of here. I don't like you anymore, So, what we mean by value in that sense is the direct opposite of what we're talking about here, right? So, just to drive home the kind of absurdity of this, right? Some things are very important, but have no exchange value, right? Like, what's the value of the sun? Obviously, without the sun, we all be dead, right? So, but does it have an exchange value? No, right? You can't exchange the sun with anything, right? The sun is not a commodity, right? The sun is not something that's produced for sale. So even though it's very, very important, right? The life on Earth depends on the sun, but it has no exchange value. So we have to just make that very clear, right? Now also, look, value comes from nature and from labor, okay? That's Marxism following political economy for hundreds of years, right? So things that contain no labor can enter a market and become commodities, okay? In which they will have a price, which is going to depend on their scarcity and lots of other factors, right? But labor is probably going to be required to make use of the item, okay? And that would then give it some value, okay? So when we think about a tree, right? So here's a tree, right? Is this a commodity? Generally speaking, the answer is no, right? A commodity is usually something that you can take and move someplace, right? The tree is, look, it's stationary, right? Now, things that come from trees are commodities, right? Lumber is a commodity, but what lumber is not this, right? Even though it's closely related, right? Lumber is a product that's made from trees, but you have to add some labor to get that to happen, do you not? I mean, you have to cut it down, then you have to, make additional cuts so that it has, a certain shape, flat sides, and so forth, right? So that's adding labor to something that came from nature, right? So the thing that is in nature, well, that's not a human category, right? That's just a gift to us, right? Again, it's like the value of the sun. So the tree itself is not necessarily a commodity, right? Lumber is the commodity, okay? Now I know what you're thinking, okay, sometimes trees are sold as trees, right? Usually in a box or something, right? Maybe they're a little bit smaller, small enough to be in a pot, or maybe they're in a really big pot or something and you have to transfer it on a forklift or something like this, right? Okay, well, so again, the action of the tree growing out of a seed or however it grew out of a little sapling, um, that is nature, right? Nature did that. But human labor is often involved, right? Somebody has to care for the tree. Somebody has to water the tree. Somebody has to, get rid of the pests and whatever, right? That's adding labor to nature, okay? So the price of that tree, right, is going to have a certain value because of the labor that went into it, or because it might be a price that is empty of value. That's also possible. Okay, so next example is going to make this a little bit clearer. Okay, so let's say we have something like this. Okay, land for sale, right? And it's unimproved. Okay, I paid $50,000 for a piece of unimproved land, but I'm concerned. What's the value of it, right? Did I pay too much or too little? What's the value? Can we use the labor theory of value to understand this? Well, so look, not every transaction is going to involve value. Okay, unimproved land does not have a value in terms of exchange value, right? So this is again, we have to see more deeply into this, right? Why not? Well, look, even if it has a price, because society has a real estate market, because society sells land, right? But again, the land is not a commodity, right? A commodity is something that is produced to sell, okay? No one can produce land, right? Especially when we're talking about unimproved land. That's a gift from nature, okay? Now, we can capture that gift from nature, and then we can say, this is mine, I'm going to defend it, and if you want it, then you either have to kill me or you have to buy it from me, right? I mean, this is how private property and land was established, right? It's not because somebody made something, they didn't build it themselves, right? They just captured it, okay? So that's a different thing, right? So that land is going to have a price, but if it's unimproved, it's not going to have a value. Now, this is possible, right? This is totally possible, explainable within the labor theory of value, right? Uh, Improved land has value added, okay? So we are adding value to it by using labor, by adding constant capital, creating perhaps buildings or irrigation or other infrastructure, roads perhaps, right? So then it does have a value component, right? Because those things are the product of labor. But its price may exceed the value, right? Because as we've seen, right, in a society where land is bought and sold, then land has a price, right? Even though it does not have a value. Okay, so different concepts. All right, what about this, right? Look at this painting and this guy holding it right here. This is a painting made by one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, that is Picasso, Pablo Picasso. So here's the question, okay? Isn't this a $28 million painting? Isn't this painting by Picasso proof that value doesn't have to do with SNOLT, it has to do with whatever the market will bear, okay? So different position here, right? Value is whatever people are willing to pay, okay? That's not the labor theory of value, right? That's a different value theory. Uh, so it isn't the use value of the painting that gives it such a high price, right? Um, it's not because it contains that quantity of socially necessary abstract labor time, right? No, it's because the fame of the artist and its unique status, right? How many versions of that painting are there? There's one, okay? Now, could somebody make a decent copy of it? Are there artists who have the skills to reproduce that painting almost exactly, so that nobody could tell the difference? Of course there are, right? Picasso is one of the most copied artists of all time, right? Lots and lots of people have the skills to produce that exact same painting, right? Will that painting, that copy, be worth? They could produce even the copy of the signature or whatever, right? Well, would that painting be worth then $28 million? No, right? Even though it has exactly the same, amount of socially necessary abstract labor in it, right? Yeah, but it's not a Picasso, right? It doesn't have the provenance. You can't prove that it was made by Picasso himself, right? So now we see, okay, look, we are interested in fame, right? Fame plays a role, right? That allows you to produce a absolutely unique object that even other artists who have the skills to paint like that, and of course, lots of Picasso's contemporaries, had similar level of skill, even produced the things of very similar style, right? Because Picasso is part of an entire movement in art, right? Um, so the point is, right, these things allow the price to exceed the value, okay? There is still a value of a painting, right? It's just that this particular painting commands a price well above that, right? Because of the factors that I mentioned. All right, so question, okay, who figures out how much labor goes into commodities? Is there some kind of central agency or someone, who does this averaging of all the different forms of labor to come up with abstract labor, and who determines whether it's socially necessary and all that stuff, right? How does that happen, right? So the answer is, well, we all do this, right? Every time we buy or sell in markets, right? Markets are engines of comparison. The value is worked out through innumerable transactions, okay? Buying and selling is in effect comparing one thing to another, and one of the bases of comparison is how much labor, socially necessary abstract labor, went into producing it. Market prices are the outcomes of millions of comparisons between what it takes to produce one thing versus what it takes to produce another. And will the market support a price that is different from the value? All right, next point here, can value change? Yes, absolutely, value can change, okay? So a lot of Marx's argument in Capital is about how value changes through the dynamics of capitalist competition. So one part of this Marx calls the accumulation of capital, okay? And let's just do a brief example of the accumulation of capital, kind of see how this works, okay? So accumulation of capital is taking a portion of the surplus and reinvesting it, right? Taking it and investing it in new, more productive machinery and equipment. Now this produces a delta C, okay? So this little triangle right here, right? Delta, that means change in, okay? And then we are, hiring or using more machinery, okay? Maybe we're buying more machinery, or maybe we upgrade some of our machinery, okay? Now we might also hire workers, okay? So that's gonna increase the wage bill, right? There's gonna be a delta V, okay, a change in the wage bill. And we are also then going to increase the surplus, okay, delta S, during that next period, okay? So let's look at how this would work, okay? So period one, okay, we have produced a certain amount of value equal to C plus V plus S, okay? That's our value equation. Period two, well, we have the C that we started with, plus we have the change in C, okay, the additional amount. We got the V that we started with plus the additional amount. And we got the S that we had in period one plus an additional amount, because we have produced our initial amount of value plus an additional amount. If there's returns to scale, right, what this means is that the cost per unit falls, and each use value contains less socially necessary abstract labor, okay? The value per unit has gone down, right? Marx says, isn't this interesting, right? That capitalism can actually cause a fall in the unit value, and not only can it cause it, it's a very, very common. I mean, we can scarcely think of one commodity that capitalism hasn't done this with, right? It's unbelievably common. What kind of effects might this have, right? So Marx argues capitalism is both very dynamic and also very contradictory, okay, in terms of constantly revolutionizing the means of production, the phrase that Marx uses, and then connecting this to the tendency for profit rates to fall through the process of competition, and that might lead to a crisis of capitalism. Again, we're not talking about a deterministic argument. We're not talking about a simplistic, oh, if A happens, then B happens. We're not talking about one billiard ball striking another. We're saying, because it's so complex and there's so many different complex factors, this might happen, right? These contradictions might cancel each other out, or they might become more heightened over time. They might get worse, right? Um, that is the thing that Marx was fascinated by, of course, because his goal overall was to eliminate exploitation, right? To move beyond capitalism, to create a system that was focused on human need and human well-being, and put that first and foremost, okay? Not the expansion of value, which capitalism puts first and foremost, okay? The expansion of value is a very different goal. It's a very different priority than making sure that all are fed and housed and, clothed and, educated and so forth, right? So that's a very different, right? A system where society's wealth would truly be used for the benefit of all, well, that would be called something else, right? Socialism, and ultimately communism, right? A society which is so committed to sharing and cooperation that exploitation is like a distant memory, like a bad dream. Okay, instead of being the absolute basis of society and all but inescapable, it's like, oh right, yes, back in the past we had that. Right. All right, so let's talk about the determination of wages. Now Marx has a lot to say about this. We're just going to touch on it here in this lecture. Marx argues that in order to understand wages, we have to distinguish between labor and labor power. Okay, so let's define these things. So labor is the process of transforming nature through human activity. When a capitalist employer hires a worker, they do not buy the worker's labor, okay? Labor is a process, right? You can't buy the process, right? You can buy a thing, right? That's not what is being purchased, okay? So I know we talk about the labor market or whatever, right? So Marx says, look, we need to be careful about what we're doing here, okay? What is actually purchased in the labor market is not labor, but rather the worker's labor power, okay? This is an important distinction. Labor power is the capacity to perform labor in a given amount of time. Now that's a different thing, right? Because when you've purchased a person's time, you purchase their potential on labor, right? How much labor are they actually going to perform? Well, guess what? How much labor the capitalist gets from the labor power they purchased is the entire class struggle of capitalism in miniature. Okay, so let's say the wage is $10 an hour, and you hire 3 workers. Okay, now depending on how quickly and skillfully and productively they work, they will add value at different rates. And let's say that each one of these 3 workers does that in a different fashion. Okay, at a different rate. So worker 1, let's say, okay, there they are. They're adding value through the labor process. They're taking the tools, equipment, raw materials, and so forth. The embodied labor, they're adding their living labor to it, and at the end of that hour, they have produced $10 in value. Okay, worker 2, so this is the total value added over here. Worker 2, again, is doing the same thing. Okay, adding living labor to the embodied labor. This worker is able to produce $20 in value added. Okay, so now we're abstracting from the amount of the constant capital. I'm just talking about how much was added to the value of the raw materials. Okay, so the total is going to be greater than this, but this is just the part that the worker is responsible for, right? This is the living labor. Okay, when I say value added. Okay, worker 3 works a little bit harder, a little bit faster. Maybe they're a little bit better at it. Whatever. They're able to produce $30 of value. Okay, so see this, right? Yeah, how much labor you get out of the labor power can really differ, right? Worker 1, you get $10 from them. Worker 2, you get 20. Worker 3, you get 30. So see how you're not buying labor, right? Because what you've paid for is the capacity to perform labor, and you paid all 3 workers the same, right? $10 for that hour. But you got very different results from it, okay? Now, of course, if your workers are like worker 1, you have a very clear action item in front of you, don't you? Which is terminate that worker. Terminate, terminate, terminate. You must, right? because they're not adding anything, right? I mean, you paid them $10, they added $10 in value. That's no good. Where's the profit in that, right? You need them to produce more than you pay them, right? There's actually, that worker has produced no surplus whatsoever. Fire them, right? I'm sorry, it's not working out. You are fired. Oh, you don't want to be fired? Well, be like worker two. Or maybe I'll give you one more chance. Or maybe I have to fire you. I have to, you know what, I changed my mind. I have to fire you. Because the only way I'll keep worker two and worker three working hard is out of that fear of getting fired. If I don't fire you, then where's the fear, right? So how much of a threat is firing somebody? How easy is it to get another job? What happens to you if you get fired, right? Well, that depends on a whole host of factors, doesn't it, right? So, but we're not going to get into that. We're just establishing the difference here between labor, that is the result of that hour's work, and labor power, okay? Labor power is the commodity for sale that's in what we call the labor market. Really, we should call it the labor power market. All right, so let's talk now about some of the criticisms of the Marxian labor theory of value that have been given over the years. So, because value theory is seen as the cornerstone of Marxian theory, Marx's labor theory of value has been more heavily criticized than any other part of the theory by those who disagree with Marx's indictment of capitalism, right? So let's look at some of these criticisms, okay? So first of all, number one, the idea that value doesn't exist, only price exists, all right? So very old criticism. Now, despite the entire tradition of classical political economy using value, modern neoclassical economics has discarded the concept. They call it metaphysical. They don't see it as necessary. This criticism is that the labor theory of value must explain prices, not values, since only price is observable, not value, and hence value represents a kind of faith-based concept, right? We don't want to take anything on faith. We want to just have things that have an independent reality, right? We're not studying ghosts or spirits or whatever, right? We're studying things that, have real world effects. Okay, that's the criticism. So if I might offer a kind of response to this, it's very clear that value exists both as a concept and in reality. Okay, if it did not, there'd be no such thing as a great deal, right? Well, hey, look at this, I got a great deal on this. What are you saying with that? You're saying the price that I paid is less than the value. Well, what are you doing? You're affirming that there's a value that's different from the price, conceptually different, that it's possible to pay less for something. Like, this is worth $50, but I only paid 10. Yes, this is fantastic. Best day ever, right? Or it could go the other way. What a ripoff. Oh no, I paid a price much greater than the value. Oh, I hate that, right? That's so bad, right? Unless you're the seller, in which case it's good, right? But this is a very widespread concept in our society. It's so widespread that saying something is a great deal, I mean, can you imagine a more cliched phrase than that in American culture, right? Because value is a social reality, we have some notion of the value of commodities, okay? We understand that in money units. So, if I said, hey, I like those pants, those are fantastic, they really look good on you. And you said, oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I only paid $5,000 for them. I'd be like, whoa, what? That's much greater than the value, right? I mean, I don't need to be a professional, tailor or a clothing maker or whatever, right? In order to know that. I know that $5,000 is not the value. Like, maybe I don't know exactly what it is, right? But I have an idea, right? Say, hey, look, the value of some pants ranges somewhere between $30 and $100. But that's enough of a range for me to know that if you paid $5,000, look, you paid a price well above the value, right? And I'd say, damn, you really got ripped off, right? Now, people get ripped off for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes being ripped off is an item of pride, right? And say, hey, I've got the money, I can burn it, Let me show you how, I'm going to leave the price tag on just so you can see that's how much they cost, right? Oh, what a flex, right? So now this is one thing that makes traveling to another country very disorienting because our understanding of value, we have this in our minds, right? We have hundreds or thousands of different commodities and a rough idea of what the value of each one is, right? And we use that all the time, right? If we see something that is overpriced, we're like, well, forget it, right? Or something that's underpriced, well, oh, we're very interested, right? As buyers. If we travel to another country, we're disoriented, right? Because we go to buy something and we're like, I don't understand these units, right? Okay, I got to do the conversion, right? I'm in Germany. Okay, Deutschmarks to $2 or whatever it is, right? Um, that's a little complicated, right? That's that you're having to do math in your head, right? Why are you having to do that? Because you don't want to get ripped off, right? Because value exists as a concept, because it's a reality, right? Um, okay, so it's used in things like bargaining and negotiation, right? What is a fair price for something, right? Um, it enables an understanding of what forces shape prices and price changes. So very, very useful to have some notion of value, right? We don't want to just stop at the appearance, right? Price is the appearance. We want to go deeper than that and look at, well, what causes it, right? What should it be? That's what value does for us, okay? So just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's not real, right? I mean, you can't see thoughts, right? We have no machine that measures your thoughts or that tracks your thoughts, right? Thank God. Are they real though? Yeah, they're real, right? Just because we can't see something, it doesn't mean it's not real. Okay, so next criticism, Marxian theory is logically flawed. Now, this aspect of the criticism of Marxian theory is pretty detailed mathematically. I'm going to give a kind of overview of it, okay? Non-mathematical overview of it. So this criticism posits a logical contradiction between two parts of the theory, okay? That is the theory of value and the formation of a general rate of profit between different industries. So Marx argues that different industries may have different organic compositions of capital. That would produce a different value rate of profit between the industries, okay? However, Marx also argues, following Ricardo, that competition and capital mobility, that is, the movement of firms from one industry to another, say, hey, I don't like being in this industry. I heard that you can make higher profits over in that industry. Well, that should equalize the profit rate, right? Because the movement of capital tends to level everything out, okay? The competition in the high profit industry is going to tend to bring down value and price, and that is going to equalize the profit rate across different industries, assuming that they're all equal in every other way. Okay, and Marx goes through a very detailed discussion of that in volume 1 of Capital, adds to that in volume 2 and 3. The equalization of the profit rate should occur through prices. Okay, that causes the value to differ from what Marx initially argues in volume 1 of Capital. He offers a modification of it in volume 3. He transforms value into price of production. Okay, so, and because he uses this term transform, a lot of people who looked at this later refer to this as the transformation problem. Okay, and some argued that Marx made a mistake, that he did this wrongly, and this debate has gone on for ever since the volume 3 of Capital was published in 1894. By the way, after Marx died, right? So this is not a part that of Marx's theory that Marx was able to finish to his satisfaction, right? If he had been able to do that, he would have published it while he was still alive, right? So Engels took the notebooks and notes and so forth that Marx left behind and edited them and put them out as volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. Okay, so the transformation problem comes out of people studying Marx later, okay, at the very end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, which is where this literature on this transformation problem comes from, okay? So there's been a variety of different responses to this over the years. The one that I hold myself, right, there's differences of points of view among Marxists, of course, just like anywhere else. My feeling is the transformation problem comes out of a very deterministic reading of Marx, right, that claims that since labor is seen as the essence of value, it should then be possible to explain prices solely in terms of labor hours. That price that labor hours should map exactly to to price, right? That's what we mean by the transformation of value into price, okay? Again, that is really not consistent with Marx's epistemology, okay? Marx does not argue that, right? Marx does not argue that prices ought to be solely determined by labor or anything else, okay? Um, Marx is well aware that prices fluctuate and are the result of many, many different forces, right? That doesn't change the theory of value. It just acknowledges that what we're doing is very complex, right? So the logic of overdetermination makes solving the transformation problem totally unnecessary, right? The goal is not to argue that SNOLT, socially necessary abstract labor time, determines prices. What would be the point of that, right? What would be the point of producing such a simplistic argument when no economic theory has a good record of predicting prices, right? I mean, it would be one thing if, okay, well, hey, despite its logical problems, we got to use this theory because it's so good at predicting prices. Well, no, it's not, right? That's not its function, which is good because no other theory is good at predicting prices either. And if it was good at predicting prices, there's no way on earth I would share it with you guys, right? I would just use it to get rich myself, right? Why would I give away the secret to the goose that laid the golden eggs, right? No way. I would just keep it a secret. Economic theories do not do a good job of predicting prices. Next criticism, labor is not the essence of value. Okay, so now some of these criticisms conflict with one another, and it just shows that, there's many people who are, intervening here, right? Marx is an absolutely huge figure, not just in economics, but in many, many different fields, right? So whenever you're influential, then lots of people criticize you, right? And they criticize you on a host of different bases, okay? So this is a different kind of criticism, okay? Labor is not the essence of value. This is saying, look, labor is not the only unique factor, right, that every commodity has in common. Marx sets up his argument like this in Volume 1. He says there's something that every commodity has in common, okay, and that's labor. Critics pointed out, well, it just depends on how you look at it, right? I mean, you could use almost any commodity as, that everything contains some of this, right, or is derived from some of this, right? Why do you use, like, some critics said, why should you use human labor? Why don't you use sewing machine labor? Why not use sheep labor? Why use human labor? Okay, or so here's a fanciful example, right? The peanut theory of value, right? Every commodity, some peanuts were either used as an input or they were used as an input for something that was used as an input, right? So we could use the peanut as the essence of value, and then we would have a peanut theory of value, for example, right? Why don't we do that, right? So here's a reference to that, right? Some of my old professors actually at UMass Amherst. Okay, so response, look, while this is technically true, it's not very useful, right? Unless you're a peanut. If you're a peanut, then yeah, it makes sense to use that as the basis, right? But since we're human beings, it makes sense to use labor, right? Labor is the most relevant input to understand production and value for humans. If we were sheep, then yeah, maybe we would want to use a sheep theory of value, right? But we're not. We're humans, right? That's a very sensible entry point to use, right? Mr. Peanut might feel differently, right? Mr. Peanut says, I like the labor theory of value. Yeah, we should use that. All right, the marginalist critique number 4. Over time, this has become kind of the dominant critique. So it's a little more detailed. The transformation problem was very influential in the early to mid 1900s, but it's kind of faded over time, right? So a marginalist critique, because of the dominance of this new form of economics that this comes out of, that is neoclassical theory. So neoclassical economics arises in the latter half of the 1800s. So, like, broadly speaking, from about 1860 to 1900 or so is when this kind of economics is created and formalized, okay? And it brings with it a new theory of value, okay? It has much older roots, but it has something new to it as well, okay? So neo means new, classical means old or classic, right? So what is this new thing that was added to the classics? Well, it's utility theory, right? And this was initially called the subjective theory of value because of its emphasis on subjective factors, right? Basically arguing that whatever gives a person utility, that is, whatever makes a person happy, well, that is value to that person, right? And so value is totally subjective, right? It just depends on, oh, I like this, you like that, right? Everybody has their own version of value, okay? So again, from an individualistic perspective, it's like this makes a lot of sense to us, right? Um, so let's examine this, okay? Later, of course, it was called marginalist. That's due to its focus on the margin, okay? The margin comes from a mathematical concept of the derivative. It represents an infinitesimally small change in something, okay? So the marginalists, the early neoclassical theorists, used a lot of calculus, and they felt like that made a stronger theory, created certain problems for them as well. But this is why they were called the marginalists. So neoclassical value theory posits that price is always equal to value, right? They do not believe in the concept of value at all, right? So that makes it kind of similar to the first criticism, okay? That value doesn't exist as a separate category. It's always equal to price, and price is determined by three factors, okay? Number one is people's preferences, okay? This is that subjective element, okay? I like a certain thing, you don't like that thing, right? I like peanuts, you're allergic to them, we're not going to buy them, right? They're bad for you, okay? That's preferences. Number two is technology, okay? We'll get more into that. That's the ability, the knowledge that we have to produce things with certain inputs. And three is the inputs themselves. This is called the resource endowments. Now, the entire marginalist or neoclassical theory is outside our area for here, right? I'm just going to kind of give you an overview. There's whole courses in microeconomics that go into this in far more detail, but here's an overview, okay? So again, three determinants of value or price, okay? Preferences, and these preferences are embodied in something called the utility function, okay? The utility function is a mathematical formula, okay? It says the amount of utility, U, is a mathematical function of, okay, F parentheses, good 1, good 2, good 3, etc., right? Sometimes we could add to this the amount of leisure and so forth, right? We could add additional arguments to it, but basically the utility function says, look, the quantity of goods and services that you take in, that's what makes you happy, okay? And your preferences shape this utility function, okay? So even though we might all have exactly the same general format of a utility function, my unique preferences mean that my coefficient for this term is different from yours, for example, okay? So everyone might have a different utility function based on our different preferences, okay? That's neoclassical theory. That causes, along with other stuff, right? This causes the demand curve, okay? What causes the supply curve? Well, that is technology, okay? Technology is understood in neoclassical theory to be the production function, okay? The production function is the relationship between output, that's Q, the quantity of finished goods, and the inputs, okay? The labor and capital that go into production, okay? And the final thing, the resource endowments, that's the amount of labor and capital that there are in society and that each group, individual owns, okay? So from the utility function, we get marginal utility. From technology, we get marginal productivity. And from the resource endowments, we get the incomes which go to workers and capitalists, and the input prices which firms use to determine how much they're going to buy of labor and capital and so forth, right? These things together then determine, here's the supply and demand graph, perhaps the most famous graph in all of economic theory, right? Comes out of neoclassical theory, famous neoclassical economist Alfred Marshall, okay, writing in the 1890s. So what this is saying is, look, the equilibrium price, okay, what is called in theory P star, okay, equilibrium price, the price at which the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are identical, they are the same, equal to Q star, okay, the equilibrium quantity. That this is what determines the price, okay, and it's seen as, again, it's a very deterministic relationship, okay. These three forces, see how the arrows only go in one way, right? There's no arrow going back, right? There's no understanding of like, well, can prices also shape people's preferences? No, that's not part of it, right? Do prices affect technology in any way? No. Okay. Do prices or quantities affect the amount of resource endowments? No, right? This is a one-way street, okay? A causes B, right? One billiard ball strikes another billiard ball, right? It's a good example of economic determinism, okay? They use three causes, not one, right? But those three causes are seen as the ultimate final determinants of the price slash value, okay? That is neoclassical value theory, okay? It's called marginalism because so much attention is placed on the margin, right? Marginal utility, that is what forms the demand curve, okay? Marginal productivity, that is what leads to the supply curve through marginal cost and so on, okay? So, we could get into the details and so on, but this would be a different course. A little bit of an awkward issue for neoclassical theory is that the theory looks to Smith and Ricardo as intellectual forebears, all right? It argues that free market capitalism maximizes the wealth of a nation, but on the other hand, the theory rejects the labor theory of value, which both Smith and Ricardo used. That's awkward, right? That means you have to kind of do a tortuous interpretation of Smith and Ricardo. If people are going to actually read it, they're going to find that what Smith and Ricardo argue is very different from the neoclassical theory of value. So here's Smith, okay? Smith is saying the things which have the greatest value in use, okay? Meaning he's talking about the subjective use value, right? Have frequently little or no value in exchange. And on the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. Can you give us an example, Adam Smith? Certainly, my friend. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it, right? Of course, if you don't have it, you die, right? So it's pretty damn useful, right? I mean, it's pretty important. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, right? You could live your whole life without a diamond. But a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. Okay, that is Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 4. So very early on in The Wealth of Nations, you don't have to read far into this big book in order to get this perspective from Adam Smith, right? Now, here's what I mean by tortuous interpretation. Okay, neoclassicals are forced to give this quote an absolutely bizarre interpretation. They call it the water diamond paradox, arguing that Smith, he's scratching his head and puzzling over this problem, and what determines the value of water and diamonds? What a contradiction to my theory. Now, this is absurd. Read the quote. It's not a long quote. Smith is not puzzling over it. He's not flummoxed by it. It's not a paradox. It's an example. He's just using it to illustrate the labor theory of value. He's turning over in his grave right now saying, do you guys think this is a paradox? It's not a paradox at all, right? It's just a little piece of my argument, right? It's not, so what's the argument? Well, water doesn't have much exchange value because it doesn't take much labor to obtain it, right? If it did take a lot of labor to obtain it, let's say we were in a very arid climate or something, right? There's not much water around. You have to dig, 50-foot well or something to get water. Well, then water is going to have a high exchange value in that setting, right? Because it takes a lot of labor. I mean, you ever dig a 50-foot deep hole? That's hard to do, right? So in England, where Smith is writing, right, water is pretty plentiful. It streams and it rains and, rains all the time, right? Diamonds, on the other hand, have a high exchange value because it takes a lot of labor to obtain a diamond. I mean, you got to do a lot of digging before you find a diamond, right? They're rare, first of all, and they're found deep underground. Once you even have a raw diamond, then you still have labor to do, right? You have to cut it and polish it and all this stuff, right? So diamonds have a lot of labor embodied in them, right? That is what gives them value. That's Smith's argument, okay? So, let's give a response to the marginalist critique in general, okay? The marginalist theory or neoclassical theory offers a different explanation for price and value than does Marxism. And this different explanation is neither better nor worse, okay? It has a different area of emphasis, it has different effects upon the practitioners of the theory and upon society as a whole, right? Neoclassical economics focuses on the fairness of markets, on the choices offered in markets, on the benefits of markets to society, on the efficiency of markets, all these things, right? It does not focus on the exploitation of capitalism. In fact, that's not even a category, right? Exploitation doesn't exist in a competitive market, right? That is basically neoclassical economics argument. So what's the effect on the practitioners? Well, the practitioners have a hard time seeing how capitalism could be unfair, right? Because to them, they're focused on the fairest aspects of it, right? Or they are looking at it in a certain way, which emphasizes that every exchange is an even exchange, right? So, okay, that's interesting, but it's very different than Marxism, right? Now, neoclassical theory has some problems of its own, though, right? It's not like it's free of problems. So, since we've given the neoclassicals their due and offered their, given their theory and given them a lot of space in a presentation on Marx's labor theory of value, right? Well, let's offer a counter critique then of the marginalist theory, okay? Because, like I said, it has plenty of its own problems. What are these? Well, number one, it's very ironic that the neoclassicals are going to say, well, you can't use value because value is not observable. You know what's not observable? Utility is not observable. Utility is not measurable, right? There's no evidence that a utility function exists. Talk about faith-based, my God, right? You cannot have a mathematical equation that contains non-observable, non-measurable variables. So, Marxists could look at neoclassical theory and be like, this is pure fantasy, Uh, don't talk to me about value being unobservable when you're going to use utility theory. That's also not observable, okay? Now, number two, the production function contains its own kind of logical problem, right? A logical circularity, okay? The quantity of capital that is one of the causes, okay, resource endowments, depends upon the price of capital, which is the effect, okay? So it's a little bit like saying, I need the answer to explain to you the answer, right? It's like, no, that's not how you get someplace, right? That's not how you have a theory, right? The theory is supposed to say, okay, here's what causes stuff to happen, right? However, right, you could have a complexly determined, right, overdetermined thing, right? That's okay. Well, Marx uses that kind of logic, but that's not what neoclassical theory does, right? It's a problem because neoclassical theory uses a very determinist logic, right? It's a very positivistic kind of theory that says, look, there's facts and opinions, and we're only concerned with facts. That's all, right? And the problem is then there shouldn't be any logical contradiction in your theory, right? But the production function is extremely illogical, right? It basically, we cannot really say that if there's different kinds of capital that last different amounts of time, that there could be such a thing as the production function, okay? This is a very well-established criticism made by Joan Robinson and others. It's sometimes known as the Cambridge Capital controversy. So, big problem for neoclassical theory. All right, number three, look, if we're dealing with a fact-based positivist theory of price, well, you know what they say, the proof is in the pudding, okay? So prove to me that it works by predicting prices. Oh, you're going to tell me you actually can't predict prices better than anybody else? Well, okay, and so you're using things that are unobservable and illogical, and they can't even predict better? I don't see the value in it, right? No pun intended. Okay, so that's my coverage of the labor theory of value. Thank you very much.